You're watching Reason and Theology Live, a show dedicated to charitable discussion, debates, interviews, commentary, and analysis. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examinations. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
Welcome to Reason and Theology, everyone. Your host, Michael Lofton. Going to be joined by Dr. R.T. Mullins here in just a moment. We're going to be talking about God and Emotion, which is his book. It's been published by Cambridge University Press in late 2020. It's available on Amazon.com. I will be putting a link to it there in the description, but y'all can go check it out there right now. Again, God and Emotion, Elements in the Philosophy of Religion by Dr. R.T. Mullins. Quick bio on him. He's published over 30 essays on various topics in philosophical theology related to models of God, philosophy of time, personal identity, the problem of evil, disability theology, the Trinity, and the Incarnation. He's published 2 books, The End of the Timeless God by Oxford, and then God and Emotion, Cambridge University Press. He has held research and teaching fellowships at the University of Notre Dame, the University of Cambridge, University of St. Andrews, and the University of Edinburgh. He's also joined the Helsinki Collegium for Advanced Studies with the University of Helsinki in Finland. So again, God and Emotions with Dr. R.T. Mullins coming up next. Hello, Dr. Mullins. Welcome to the show. How are you?
Yeah, doing all right.
Yeah. You know what? You came recommended because we previously had Dr. Robert Singenis on the show, and we were talking about divine passability and whether or not God has emotions and how does that maybe work out in contrast with what is generally maintained in the Catholic tradition. And quite a few people recommended that I get you on the show and get your take on it. So that's what we're doing today. But if you can maybe give us a little bit more information about yourself. Are you a Catholic or a Protestant, or what perspective are you coming from?
Yes, I guess you could say I'm vaguely Protestant. So I am ordained in this thing called the Independent Christian Church in America. But I haven't attended a church like that in a while because I've been living overseas for so long, and that movement never really made its way outside of America. So just usually it's just whichever church nearby that I like.
And you just kind of have an interest in theology. What got you into this particular topic?
This particular topic, when I was doing my work on God and time, I was trying to look at the whole classical tradition and the whole classical picture of God. And impassibility is one piece of that puzzle. And so I was, just kind of looking at it and then realized this needs a separate treatment by itself. The stuff I was doing in the End of the Timeless God wasn't sufficient to really tackle all these issues. And then started getting into some philosophy of emotion and looking at issues related to empathy, and realized there's a lot of weird, crazy stuff going on in the neighborhood here that somebody needs to sit down and figure out.
Now, let's start with divine simplicity. Do you affirm it or deny it? Where do you land on this, and why?
So I deny it because I think that it's metaphysically impossible, and I think that it not only has zero biblical evidence, but actually is contradicted by the biblical evidence. So I published several essays on why I think it's inconsistent with God's freedom, or inconsistent with, say, the Incarnation, a bunch of different claims like that.
Yeah. And one of my questions then is going to be, I'm sure you've looked a whole lot into the works of St. Thomas Aquinas. When you've gone through, the first part of the Summa and other places where he talks about God's simplicity and the arguments that he uses for them, what are some of your concerns with what he's saying, and why you would say, no, I still reject it, and I maintain that God perhaps is complex?
Well, one of the biggest problems is if you have the claim that God has free will. So Aquinas and pretty much everybody else in the Christian tradition want to say that God has the ability to do otherwise. God didn't have to create. He could have created something else entirely. So he's got some different options here. And then Aquinas and Augustine and others will also say that whatever God has in fact done, he could have done more. He could have done less. So God has not actually done all that he could do. And I'm like, okay, well, that's interesting. how does that square with the claim that God is pure actuality, that God has no potential? Because if God could have created a different universe, well, that's an unactualized potential in God. Tradition says that, well, any of the divine persons could have become incarnate. So the Son became incarnate, but you could say the Holy Spirit or the Father could have become incarnate. And Aquinas is like, yeah, that's all possible. And I'm like, well, that's unactualized potential in God. Those are possible actions God could have performed. And then Aquinas also says there's lots of ways God could have brought about, salvation, the atonement. I'm like, right, okay. Well, all of those possible ways are unactualized potential in God. So it's really hard to figure out how you're going to get pure actuality and make it consistent with these other claims that you see from Aquinas and Augustine and Peter Lombard and everybody else. So those are some of the problems that I see with it. There's other arguments I could run too, but but that's some of it.
Now, what is some of the biblical support that you would use to maintain that God is complex?
So divine simplicity says that God has no accidental properties. So God does not have properties like creator, Lord, judge of all men. And this is really explicit in Augustine, Peter Lombard, and Aquinas, and then lots of Protestant and Catholic scholastics. John Duns Scotus says that accidental properties are repugnant to the simple God. And you're like, okay, cool. Does the Bible ever predicate accidental properties of God? And the answer is all the time. I mean, constantly, consistently. So when you look at Exodus 3, for instance, when God's like, my name is the great I am. I will be who I will be. And then right after that, in the next verse, he says, this is my name. My name is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That is my name forever. Tell everyone that my name is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And you're like, well, those are accidental properties. Why would if they're really repugnant to God, why would he be declaring that that's his name forever? Amen. And that seems kind of weird. So that would be one of just a million cases you could give in the Bible of going, here's where God explicitly takes on accidental properties and saying, these are like crucial to understanding who I really am.
Mm-hmm. And by the way, somebody's asking in the chat if you could briefly define divine passability, because I mean, some of the viewers might not be familiar with the term. So what exactly does that mean?
Mm-hmm. Actually, we should back up and define impassibility, and then we can get into passability. So kind of frame the discussion.
Sure.
Yeah. So impassibility, which is the traditional view, you don't really see a wide rejection of it until the 20th century, or kind of like the turn of the 20th century. So impassibility makes three claims. First, God cannot suffer. Second, it is impossible for God to be moved, influenced by anything outside of himself. So nothing about who you are or what you've done could move or influence God to think, feel, act, or be in any way, shape, or form. And then the third claim is that God can have any emotion that is consistent with his perfect rationality, his perfect goodness, and then his perfect undisturbed happiness. Now, notice I said that God has emotions on impassibility. And this is what most of the scholarship today affirms, as saying, yes, that's right. And then I could even point to different classical theists like William Shedd, who say God has two emotions, love and wrath. And you're like, oh, okay. And then he's like, but they got to be consistent with his perfect happiness. And happiness is a common emotion that everybody from Origen on through the rest of the tradition want to say that God has. Here's the claim, though. So remember, God can't be influenced by anything outside of himself. And so you're like, well, why is God so happy? Well, God's happiness is grounded entirely in himself. He says, well, I'm the greatest possible good. And you're like, sure, okay, God's the greatest good. And so, if you're in the right relationship with the greatest good, you're going to be happy. And well, God's in the right relationship with the greatest good because he is the greatest good. So he's going to be happy. And so his emotions are tracking the values in the world. They're tracking what the greatest good is. And so that's the idea. So God's in a state of pure, undisturbed happiness, bliss, felicity, all the different kind of words you want to use for it. And that's why he can't suffer. Mm-hmm. So that's impassibility. Passability wants to make three parallel claims. So they want to go, God, he can suffer. He can totally suffer. That's fine. Second, they want to say God can be influenced by things external to himself. And then third, they want to say that, God can have emotions that are consistent with perfect rationality and his perfect goodness. They're happy with that. But they don't want to affirm that criterion that God has to have emotions that are only consistent with his perfect happiness. They want to go, God can have a range of emotions that, are not happy. And here's why. They want to say that God's emotions are properly tracking the values in the world, just like the Impassabilists wanted to say. But they want to say, well, if I look at a bunch of sinful things, that, if you're looking at a bunch of sinful things, that should disturb you. That should make you upset. That should make you angry. Well, that's not really consistent with being perfectly happy. If you're being angry, but it's perfectly rational to be upset or angry at sin. So yeah, God's going to have some emotions that are, going to be like happiness sometimes. Other times he's going to have emotions like anger or sadness. Kind of depend on what's going on in the world. So that's passability in a nutshell.
One of the questions I think some are going to wonder also, again, comes kind of from Aquinas. He talks about God as being pure act and having no potency. And this then relates to whether or not he is simple and complex. So if he's complex, the argument goes there would have to be something that put him into composition, if you will, something prior to him, which is impossible. What do you say in response to that?
So Al-Ghazali and then in our own day, Matthew Badorf have pointed out there is no argument for that principle. There's no good reason to affirm that principle. So you can just go that principle about composition. Well, I don't need to believe it. There's no reason to think it's true. And in fact, I think the Christian tradition gives you a counterexample to this principle. Here's the counterexample: Incarnation. Does God need something else outside of himself to compose him with the incarnate Christ, with the human nature? No, he can just do it himself directly. You don't need something outside like some third thing to do that. And to make this more clear, to really dig the knife in, the most popular models of the incarnation throughout church history are what we today call compositional models of the incarnation. And what they say is that God the Son enters into some kind of part whole or compositional relationship with the human nature. So, and you've got God just doing it directly. So you don't have this third thing composing them together. So the principles just seems like no good reason to affirm it. And Christian theology gives me a direct counterexample to this principle. So be done with the principle.
With the incarnation, the way I've always understood it is that God still remains what he is. He doesn't change anything here. He just, the second person takes on something else. He takes on human nature, not changing anything in the Godhead, but taking on something. Why would you say that then introduces complexity into God in and of itself?
Well, for starters, if you really are affirming the traditional compositional Christology, well, it's right there in the name, compositional. So you'd have to be entering into some kind of compositional relationship.
In the hypostases, the one hypostasis. So in other words, the one hypostasis takes on a human nature. Yeah.
Yes, that person enters into this complex, this part whole relation. And so nothing about that changes the situation here by saying hypostasis or person. So yeah, this one person does that. Now, but I do think it does involve a change, and here's why. One, the human nature didn't always exist. God's always existed, but the human nature didn't always exist. So couldn't enter into a hypostatic relation with this human nature when it did not exist. And then all of a sudden it comes into existence. Well, it seems like when God the Son enters into that hypostatic relation with this human nature, that's a new thing. And you could go, well, God doesn't change. I'm like, well, how? He's entered into a unique relationship, something that really is supposed to be an utterly unique relationship that he's nothing else like it has that. You can't enter into a new relationship and not change. And you can't also, be incarnate and walk around and do things with a body and not change. I don't know how you're gonna get no change there. Aquinas, what his view is to say, there's no change because God the Son's not really related to his human nature. A lot of Anselmians will scratch their head at that and go, if he's not really related to his human nature, well, then you don't get a hypostatic union. A hypostatic union is supposed to be a personal, deeply personal, intimate relationship with this human nature, but he's not really related to it. That doesn't make any sense. And so I think it makes no sense, because I really do think that if God the Son is not really related to his human nature, and he's not really related to my human nature either, then I don't know what the difference is between me and Jesus, such that he's the incarnate Son and I'm not. I want to say the difference between me and Jesus is God the Son has a really unique relationship, a real relationship with that human nature and not mine. And so that's what's supposed to be the difference. But if you deny that there's a real relation there, then I don't know what the difference between me and Jesus is.
So some have tried to maybe account for what you're discussing here about how can he interact with us and become incarnate. Some have tried to say that, okay, there's a distinction between God's essence and then his energies, which loosely is his activities, but not necessarily. And of course, it comes from the theology of Gregory Palamas, right? Have you looked much into that, and what is your response to the Palamite view?
The Palamite view is interpreted in a bunch of different ways, and I don't know which one to go with. So some Eastern Orthodox theologians will tell me this is a alternative to divine simplicity. They're like, divine simplicity, it's that evil, that Catholic thing, and we don't want that. And I'm like, okay, it's fine, whatever, if that's what you want to say. And so they'll use the kind of strong language. And then some others will be like, no, actually, it's perfectly consistent with, with like this Catholic doctrine of simplicity. And I'm like, okay. And then some other Eastern Orthodox will come along and go, we love to disagree with each other. That's part of our charm. And I'm like, okay, well then I don't know what to tell you.
Right. There are different views there. Sure. But those who would advocate that there is a difference between Catholics and Orthodox here, their arguments, what have you found wanting with them?
So if I take it as a difference, then like for instance, like David Bradshaw, like he wants to run some similar kind of arguments to saying that I do, to say like divine simplicity, it's incoherent, it's not consistent with God's freedom. Well, then he's like, I've got this nice story to tell you about how you do get freedom. You've got all these different energies, and I'm like, okay, well that, as far as I can tell, what it looks like is you're saying that God's actions are not identical to his essence. And I'm like, that's fine. I like that. Mm-hmm. And so God's got this unactualized potential and he's just doing stuff. You've got this weird language of energies that I don't really understand. But if it's just saying God's got like his actions are not identical to himself and he can perform a bunch of different actions, then I'm like, okay, fine. Sounds good. But yeah, again, I find it difficult to figure out exactly how to interpret Palamas on these issues.
Yeah, there's a lot of different views on him. I mean, have you looked into the works of Palamas himself, maybe the triads or the 150 chapters? So what's your impression when you go to Palamas himself, kind of putting to the side commentaries on him?
He's a difficult thinker because there are some statements that do look like this is a rejection of, divine simplicity. Mm-hmm. But then there's these other passages where it's like the activities just are God. And I'm like, mm-hmm. Well, actually the activities are like around God. And I'm like, okay, what's the exact claim here? What's going on? And so I can't quite get to the bottom of it. And so I just kind of put it aside and just focused on other thinkers that I'm like, okay, Peter Lombard, he's easy to interpret. Like there's no weird stuff going on there. So I can understand him. So so Palamas I find interesting, but I really struggle with because there are various claims that do look like they don't quite fit together. And which is why I think when I turn to these commentaries, they're giving me very different readings and I can see they've got textual evidence on either side for their view.
Now you bring up Lombard there. So what are some of the concerns with what he says?
Mm-hmm. Like with regards to like simplicity or just... Yeah. I mean, the same arguments I would run around against Aquinas, because the claims really aren't that terribly different. So he'll still say, no distinctions in God, all these identity statements, all of God's actions are identical to each other and identical to God. And so then I can go, okay, well, so God's actions are supposed to be like contingent, like some of his actions are, like he didn't have to create the universe. Well, how could that contingent act be identical to his necessary existence? Because things that are contingent cannot be identical to things that are necessary, because necessity and contingency aren't the same thing. Those are different modal statuses. So if his actions really are going to be identical to his necessary existence, they're going to have to be necessary as well. And well, then you got God's actions not being contingent. You got God's actions being necessary. You lose free will, any sort of divine free will.
So in other words, there would be some kind of necessity imposed on God, is what you're arguing.
Yeah. And then also the further claim is when you look at God's omnipotence in the classical tradition, God's omnipotence is infallible. So whatever God wills to bring about must come about. And so if God necessarily wills that the universe exist, then the universe must exist. And so the universe is going to exist of necessity as well. What Aquinas and others want to do is they want to go, whoa, 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 whoa. It doesn't exist of absolute necessity. It exists of what's called like conditional necessity. But with conditional necessity, what you have is the prior things, the prior conditions are themselves contingent. They don't have to be that way, which like if you have those prior conditions, whatever they are, well, then the result must follow, because so you get conditional necessities necessary given some prior conditions. But as long as those prior conditions are contingent, then you don't get this like absolute necessity for the universe. And so, but the problem is, if the prior conditions are absolutely necessary, then you do get the universe existing of absolute necessity. And so if God's actions are identical to his necessary existence, those actions are going to be necessary as well. They're going to be absolutely necessary. So you can't make the distinction that Aquinas wants between like absolute necessity and then saying like the universe exists of only conditional necessity because God's actions are going to be absolutely necessary. And Aquinas is like, oh gosh, I didn't want that. I didn't want that. So you get some complications, you get some problems.
What I've seen is that some Scotus, for example, try to compensate for this with the formal distinction. What are some of the concerns that you have there?
So the formal distinction helps a bit. It helps you with like different kind of problems, like saying, well, how could omnipotence be like identical to omniscience? Because that's weird. That doesn't make any sense. And Scotus is like, no, that doesn't make any sense at all. So we'll give this nice formal distinction. And then he gets accused of not really affirming divine simplicity. And a lot of different scholars like Thomas Williams will go, yeah, he didn't really have divine simplicity. He really is weakening the doctrine quite a bit. But at least get you out of those kind of problems. It doesn't really seem to help too much with divine action, though. So you could say God has distinct acts, but Scotus still wants to say that God is pure actuality. And so you're not going to be able to get out of that, the potentiality objection that I raised earlier in this episode, where it's like, well, if God could do one thing and then something else or something else, those are unactualized potentials in God. So if God creates this universe instead of a different universe, well, he could have created that other universe. So that's unactualized potential in God. So it's not going to help Scotus out with those kind of problems. And Scotus is aware of these kind of issues. He's also aware of the issue that I mentioned for Aquinas, where if God's acts are identical to the divine nature, then, well, gosh, God's not going to have any free will. Scotus does some weird stuff to try to get around that. So he introduces these things called these logical moments in the life of God to try to get out of some different kinds of puzzles. And so what you have is within the eternal life of God, there's a logical moment where God's not doing anything. And then at the next logical moment, God is doing something. And here's why Scotus wants to introduce this. So when we typically think about freedom, what we think is at this moment, I have the ability to do some action or refrain from doing some action at the next moment. So I'm sitting right now. Well, I couldn't be doing anything other than sitting right now because I'm sitting, I'm doing it. But at the next moment, I could stand up. Mm-hmm. And that's a possibility. Or at the next moment, I could just say, I'm going to stay sitting. Well, if God's timeless, he's doing whatever he's doing. So where are you going to get this sort of free will where he could do something else at the next moment? And Scotus is like, oh gosh, that's bad. That's bad. Aha. Well, okay. Logical moments. So within the timeless present moment of God's life, there's all these different logical moments. And so he can give this kind of sequence. It's not a temporal sequence, according to Scotus. It's just a logical sequence where you've got God doing nothing, God looking at all the possible worlds he could create, and then going, I like that one. And then a next logical moment, God's like, okay, I'm going to create that one, and so on. And then when you get into people after him, they want to do all sorts of fun stuff with the logical moments to figure out how to understand predestination and providence and all that. It's interesting. I don't think it works because of this. So if you want to say that from all eternity, God knows all things, well, it's hard to figure out how from all eternity, God knows all things, but at one logical moment, he doesn't know the future because he hasn't determined anything yet. And at the next logical moment, he does know all the stuff that's going to happen because he has determined it. Well, from all eternity, God knows and does not know what's going to happen is what you end up getting. And that's a contradiction. And so that's really hard to figure out how you're going to make sense of that. So you're going to get I think you're going to get weird kind of problems like this.
Now, and by the way, somebody's asking if you could briefly define, how exactly are you defining freedom? Is it the ability to do otherwise?
It's not just that. That's one condition. So the classical tradition, when they reflect on God's freedom, they waver at different points on human freedom. But for divine freedom, they want to say this. They want to say God is free in the sense that God is the source of his actions. Nothing outside of himself is like, making God do stuff. So God is the source of his actions. And then God has the ability to do some action or a different action. So you do have the ability to do otherwise with God, but it's both of those claims. He's the source of his intentional actions, and he has the ability to do that, or some other stuff altogether. He's got a bunch of options.
Now, one thing that I've heard, and I want to get your thoughts on it, I'll do my best to articulate it. I mean, this isn't necessarily my wheelhouse, but I do my best to keep up with these conversations. It seems like some are saying that, okay, well, God is simple, and in that simplicity, he also knows every way in which a creature could participate in him. And so the potentiality is not introduced in God. The potentiality is introduced on the end of creation, and God knows how all those things could participate in him, yet he still remains simple. What do you say in response to that? What are some of the problems?
I don't think I can understand this claim, because so you've got the doctrine of divine ideas, which is God knows all the possible ways things could be and ways things could participate in him. And so that's all like necessary there. Like these are necessarily like potential things, but God has to be the one to bring them about. He has to bring about the existence of you in order for you to participate in him. So it involves a divine action to bring about any of those ideas and to make them into a reality. So the potential has to be, I mean, I don't know how you can just say God, well, it's all on the creature's end. It's like, no, God has to do something in order to make this stuff happen, in order to make these things not just merely possible ideas, but actual like realities. So it seems like it's just conveniently avoiding the actual problem. It just seems like, well, I see what God has to do, but I'm just not going to mention that part so I can get over the problem. Yeah. So it seems like it's just dancing around the problem.
Now, you also mentioned some other people in the 20th century. You said this is becoming much more popular in the 20th century. Who are some other of the main advocates for this position?
Oh, for like passability?
Yeah.
Yeah. So right before the 20th century, there's this weird debate in Ireland, and I could not track down the book. I saw it mentioned a few times. But then right at the year 1900, there's this guy named Marshall Randalls who wants to affirm impassibility. And so he starts complaining a bunch, saying like, there's all these people, like to just like denying the impassible God. And this is like, this is really bad. But he says it's just a passing mood. It's just gonna come and go. It's, then we'll forget all about it. It never happened. Well, you fast forward like 10 years, then there are people like this guy in Scotland named Bertrand Brasnet, who writes this book on the suffering of God. And then in Indiana, in the 1920s, there's a guy named Francis McConnell who starts writing a bunch of books as well, affirming passability, this idea that God suffers, God's got empathy. And then they all kind of like have a debate with each other and have a debate with like Marshall Randalls. So that's kind of where a lot of this stuff starts. You've got William James around the same time period pushing this idea as well. And then when you get a little bit further into the 20th century, then you've got Alfred North Whitehead pushing this. And then from there, then it's just like everybody wants to get on board with passability. So by the time you get to the 1970s, the New Testament scholar Richard Bauckham declares that this is the new orthodoxy. Like that passability is the new orthodoxy. So you've got people like Jürgen Moltmann wanting to affirm passability. You've got supposedly Karl Barth, but I can't figure out what Karl Barth's saying. So I don't know. I'm not a big fan of Barth. So you've got people like this. And then when you get to like contemporary, like people alive today, you've got people like Tom Ord who are affirming passability. You've got John Peckham affirming it. There's a lot of different people are affirming passability.
Mm-hmm. Now, what would you say are maybe some of the strongest arguments for simplicity and then against your position? What are some of the best ones that you've heard?
Oh, for simplicity?
For simplicity, against your view. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I don't find any of the arguments compelling because they rely on these principles of composition that I don't find remotely plausible, and that I think that the Incarnation gives a counterexample to. So like I mentioned earlier, those are the main ones. So yeah, I've just never found any of them terribly convincing. And so I mentioned Matthew Badorf earlier. So he's got a really nice paper where he's just lays out, here are the different kinds of arguments, and none of them actually get you to simplicity. Even if you grant some of the compositional principles, they don't get you there. So they're supposed to start with something like aseity, and then you add in a bunch of these like principles about composition, and then you're supposed to somehow then be able to jump to simplicity. But I just don't find them convincing at all. Yeah. Well, so yeah, I can give you like some for like arguments that I find persuasive for other classical attributes, but simplicity, I can't give you anything for that.
Let's hear a few of those.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
So since we're supposed to be talking about impassibility and passability, I'll give you one for impassibility.
Mm-hmm.
So impassibility says, okay, look, you guys want to be happy. You want to be happy, right? I mean, everybody wants to be happy. Who doesn't want to be happy? Well, how do you get happiness? Well, you want to be in the relationship with the greatest good. That's how you get happiness. And you're like, okay. So, well, what is the greatest good? Well, God's the greatest good. So you want to be in the right relationship with God in order to get happiness. Well, if it turned out that like God wasn't always happy, that his happiness was kind of like shifting and like, he's getting some kind of moody sometimes. Well, that doesn't seem like a really stable ground for happiness anymore. Like you want your ground of happiness to be like really firm and unchanging. Like you don't want it to be the sort of thing that you get there and it turns out the happiness is really fleeting. Well, impassibility is like, well, I give you that. I give you a God who is completely in the state of like undisturbed happiness. Cannot possibly be any other sort of like state. That's the strongest, most stable ground for happiness you could possibly imagine. I think that's an interesting argument. I think that has got something for it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And since we're also talking about especially God and emotions, concerning your book, maybe walk us through the book. What exactly are you doing in it? Maybe just kind of go through some of the highlights in the chapters.
Mm-hmm. So what I do in the first chapter is I just lay out basic stuff of like philosophy of emotion. So just what is an emotion? How does it relate to reason? How does it relate to morality and truth? Then in the second chapter, I'm like, all right, here's classical theism. So let's look at a model of God that actually affirms impassibility. So you can kind of see how it all kind of connects. Then in the next chapter after that, I look at a different model of God that affirms passability. So you can kind of see, again, how these debates would play out. And so I put it in a model of God called neoclassical theism. And I articulate, kind of what that model of God looks like, and then look at the claim that God has empathy. Because the classical tradition denies that God has empathy or compassion. God has no empathy, has no compassion. Maybe metaphorically, but no literal, no analogical empathy or compassion, none of that. Whereas passability wants to say God's rich in mercy. God has all sorts of empathy. Maybe he has maximal empathy. Then the chapter after that, I start going, okay, so we've got these different views. Now I want to introduce people to arguments for and against each view, because this is meant to be an introduction to the whole topic. So I look at divine love and say, all right, here is the account of love. Can classical theism in their affirmation of impassibility, can they actually say that God is loving? And so I articulate what it means for God to be loving on the impassible view, and then look at an argument that says, on the impassibilists' own understanding of divine love, they're not going to be able to actually say God is loving. Ooh, that seems like a problem. And then I look at some problems for, can God really be loving if he's going to be passable? Then in the chapter after that, I look at divine wrath. And so I'm like, okay, divine wrath, some classical theists want to affirm it, some don't. And then I run this argument saying that if God is impassible, he cannot actually have wrath. And there's some different kind of problems that pop up for why that's the case. And then I look at an objection to passability based on wrath as well, saying, is God really that good of a moral judge if he has different shifting emotions? Mm-hmm. And then in the final chapter, I look at what's called the problem of creepy emotions. So this one was fun because so there's this argument, it's called the Horny God Objection, which says like, if God really does have like this maximal empathy, that he feels everything that you feel, then does that mean that God like gets horny sometimes? Because he he feels all your feelings, and you're like, what? It feels kind of creepy. I don't know if I want that. And so then I look at that objection to passability and try to look at some ways to respond to that one. And then after that, then the book's done, and I just kind of leave it up to people to figure out how they feel about the debate.
How has it been received so far? What have been some of the comments?
The reactions?
Yeah.
Yeah, this has been interesting because I didn't quite expect, I didn't know what to expect, really, to be honest. But it's been really well received. Like, a lot of people have found it very interesting. They've liked seeing the arguments for and against. It's persuaded some people to go in one direction or the other on the debate. A lot of people laugh very hard at that last chapter, looking at the Horny God Objection. And so they're like, who knew like philosophy could be so entertaining? And, the reactions from atheists and agnostics have been the ones that are most interesting to me, because a lot of different friends that I have that are atheist or agnostic, when I was telling them about this project and going like, well, some people want to say God doesn't have any empathy, and they're like, that's awful. That's horrible. You got to tell them that they're wrong. And I'm like, you don't even think God exists. Why do you care? And for some reason, like it just really bothered a lot of people, this idea that God could not have empathy. Like, they just didn't like the idea of impassibility. Even if they don't think God exists, they're like, that just can't be. You can't have a God without empathy. And I'm like, but you just think there is no God. So, what's going on here? And what I think is going on is this issue about emotions and about what the ultimate reality is like. It really hits home to us. Like, we are creatures who crave empathy and accurate empathy. We don't want faked empathy. We bond with people who actually empathize with us. And if the heart of reality is like something that cannot empathize with you, then that makes you feel very lonely in a vast universe. Whereas if the heart of reality is a being that can empathize with you, well, then maybe you're not alone. I think that's what's going on.
One of the philosophers it's runs around in our circles a lot is Dr. Ed Fazer. Did he respond, give a review of it? Do you know what his thoughts were on it?
I don't think he's read it yet. I don't think he has an interest in reading my work after a debate we had a couple years ago on the Theopolis website.
How'd that go?
That didn't go very well. Here's why. So Theopolis was like, we want you to do something on simplicity. And I was like, okay. And they're like, we want you to debate these people. And I was like, sounds great. Let's go for it. I came up with an argument, and he didn't even mention the argument in the first draft of the of his essay responding. And so the editor went back to him and like, can you please mention a premise of the argument that you reject? And he identified a particular number of the premise, but he didn't state the premise at all. He stated a different premise. And he actually just copied and pasted from his book, and got rid of Tom Morris's name and just put in Ryan Mullins. And so he was responding to Morris's argument, that was just a completely different argument from mine, but just inserted my name as if I were running this kind of argument. So he responded to a completely different argument instead of my actual argument. And that was kind of weird. And so in my own reply, I pointed that out, and he didn't seem very happy about that. So I don't know.
No more interaction after that?
He wrote another blog post on his own blog about it, where he accused me of, what was it? I think it was something like of not reading any SCOTUS. And I was like, oh, you just haven't read my stuff then, if you think that. And so I was like, so you didn't read my essay the first time, and then you wrote another essay, once again demonstrating you haven't read me. This isn't good. So I don't know. But that was a couple of years ago. So he's maybe he's read some of my stuff by now, but yeah, I don't know. But he's got other things going on. I mean, he doesn't have to read my stuff,
Right, yeah. Right. Well, what are some of the criticisms that you have really of his position?
I mean, basically any of the stuff against impassibility, I think, is going to go against his position. He doesn't have like a ton to say on impassibility in particular. So because most of his focus is like on like simplicity stuff. So with this particular book on impassibility, I didn't really look at him a whole lot. I mentioned him in like some other work on other topics, but not for the motion book.
But aren't they related? I mean, it seems like they're intimately related, this issue of simplicity and passability and impassibility. It seems like it. Correct me if I'm wrong.
That's the claim. That is the claim. It's a common claim. And so I actually published a different paper. I didn't get into this in the book, but it's a different paper called Why Can't the Impassible God Suffer? And so the claim is that timelessness, immutability, simplicity, and impassibility are all systematically connected. They're all mutually entailing.
Mm.
And in that paper, I run through a bunch of arguments going, it's not clear that these are systematically connected. Why can't God suffer? So say he's timeless. Well, nothing about timelessness itself explains why God can't suffer, because there's no logical contradiction in saying there's a timeless being that's timelessly suffering. Same thing with immutability. There's no logical contradiction in saying there's an unchanging being that's unchangingly suffering. And then same thing with simplicity. Like there's nothing with simplicity itself that would explain why God cannot suffer, because you could have a being that's identical to his suffering. And so that's when I started digging deeper into it and trying to figure out why can't he suffer? And so I couldn't find any systematic connection between those other three attributes. Why God cannot suffer is this claim about his perfect happiness, that this is another attribute of God, that God has perfect blessedness. And so that's what's supposed to explain why God cannot suffer. So it's a different attribute altogether. It's not timelessness, simplicity, immutability, like the standard story goes. And that was surprising to me to like kind of figure that out. But yeah, it's often claimed that they are mutually entailing, but I don't think they are.
Patrick asks this. He says, does Dr. Mullins affirm or reject divine conceptualism, and why or why not?
So divine conceptualism, that's a view on God and abstract objects, where you say that properties or propositions and all this other kind of abstract stuff, it doesn't necessarily exist independent of God. Instead, these are all just like ideas in the mind of God. I find that really interesting. I'm quite attracted to it. Some days of the week, I'm like, yeah, why not? Sounds good. Then other days of the week, I'm like, I feel like propositions aren't like just ideas in the mind of God. Like it seems like they really could be like just independent things, and I don't see any problem with that. So it really depends what day of the week you ask me, how I feel about God's relationship to abstracta.
Mauricio asks, Dr. Mullins, according to your understanding of freedom, will we be free in heaven, or are angels free?
Mm-hmm. So the issue of freedom that I mentioned earlier was only for divine freedom. I personally do think that human freedom has to involve that we are the source of our actions, and that we've got some kind of leeway, the ability to do otherwise. When it comes to heaven, there's this view called virtue libertarianism. I think Dean Zimmerman was the one to coin that phrase, and then you see people like Kevin Tempe and Tim Paul trying to articulate this even further. And so here's the idea. In order to develop your character, your moral character, you need to be the source of your actions, and you also need to have that leeway. You have the ability to do like one action or a different action or a different action. And so over time, you develop this character. And so, but at some point, you're going to be developing your character, hopefully in virtuous ways. Maybe you're a really awful person, so you develop it in vicious ways. But we'll ignore vicious people. We'll focus on virtuous people. So when you become like really like built up in virtue, then there are going to be certain actions that you just couldn't perform because you're such a good person. You just wouldn't ever go around stomping on babies to hear them squeak. You just couldn't do that. Thankfully, you couldn't do that because that's just awful. And so some people might go, oh, well, we don't have the ability to like, do that action anymore. And to which the virtue libertarian says, it doesn't matter because you freely brought about that character. So you are still responsible for your character being this particular way. So it's not like some kind of like determinism where like something outside of you is forcing you to do these things. And I think that's right. But when I think about heaven though, too, like I'm like, okay, so some actions I can't perform, but I can still do other actions. Like I could go, do I want to sing this like really boring hymn from the 1800s? Or do I want to sing this really boring contemporary worship song where it repeats ad nauseum? I don't want to do either of those. I'm going to go listen to some black metal instead. Like these are options you've got in heaven, I hope, So yeah, I think you've still got like the ability to do otherwise in heaven. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I apologize.
That's right.
I did that so that I could type something because my keyboard is extremely loud. But then I always forget to unmute. Since Aquinas' proof of God's existence rely heavily on divine simplicity, does Dr. Mullins believe God's existence can be proven?
Mm-hmm. So Aquinas' proofs actually try to establish that God is simple. They don't start with God being simple. So I guess I don't, but I guess that's irrelevant though. I do think you can give lots of arguments for the existence of God. In fact, when you look at the history of not just Western philosophy, but like Eastern philosophy as well, There are tons and tons of arguments for the existence of God that don't get you anywhere near simplicity. So just to give you one example, Richard Swinburne's book, The Existence of God, he's like, here's a whole bunch of arguments that have nothing to do with divine simplicity. And I think those are really good arguments. Samuel Clarke's book, The Existence of God, he gives you a really thorough cosmological argument for the existence of God. Doesn't get you anywhere near simplicity. You don't need it. So yeah, I think it's irrelevant because you've got tons and tons of other arguments for the existence of God. You don't need Aquinas's proofs.
This one is from River Run, and thank you for the super chat. He says, wait, Ed, I think he means Dr. Ed Vaser, wouldn't deny that any perfection present in empathy is present in God. Merely God doesn't undergo passions as he doesn't think discursively. What do you say to that?
I don't remember what Ed says about empathy, but I do know what the rest of the classical tradition says, and they are incredibly explicit that God does not literally have empathy. And analogical predication, just to be clear, analogical predication is literal predication. It is not metaphorical predication. So when someone like Aquinas says God does not have mercy, God does not have compassion, when he says that, he says God does not literally have those things. That also rules out God analogically having those things. Anselm's super clear about this. Calvin's super clear about this. Contemporary thinkers like Brian Davies and Herbert McCabe are super clear about this. God does not have empathy at all. Different Protestant and Catholic classics like Guillermo Zanchias, they go a little bit further and they're like, not only does God not have any empathy, it's a good thing too, because it'd be really terrible if he did, because then he'd be influenced by you. So yeah, so it's very consistent claim throughout the entire Christian tradition that God cannot have empathy. For one place to look, Mausley's history of the doctrine of divine impassibility, it's a classic text. He lays this, he like identifies this strand all throughout the entire book, tracing it from origin all the way to what was his at that point in the present day, which was the 1920s. So yeah, this is a major classical claim.
Charlie says, doesn't the Incarnation fill all your objections on impassibility, your issues with emotions, etc.?
I want to make sure I'm understanding the idea. So is the idea that if you're complaining, well, God doesn't have any of these emotions, you're like, well, he gets them in the Incarnation. Is that kind of the idea? Is that how you're interpreting?
I think so. Let's go with it for now. Yeah.
Sure. Okay. We'll go with that interpretation. I didn't get into the Incarnation in this book because I'd done so many other papers and other things on the Incarnation elsewhere, and the book had to be really short, so I had to cut that. I think what you get is Nestorianism. So there's a brand new book that just came out on impeccability and the Incarnation, edited by Johannes Gossel. Through Rutledge. And so I've got a chapter in there arguing that if God's impassible, then you cannot get a orthodox understanding of the Incarnation. You're going to get a Nestorian account, because you're going to clearly have two different people in there. One person having empathy, one person having a range of emotions, and then another another mind that can't suffer, cannot have any emotions whatsoever. So I don't think that you would get, I just don't think you can get the Incarnation really in Orthodox.
What do you say in response then to the Chalcedonian formula? It seems to say, okay, there's no confusion and mixture, but there's also no separate. What do you say to that?
Yeah, so the argument I run there is, if you want Chalcedonian Christology, here's what it looks like. But if you want impassibility, you don't get it. You get Nestorianism. So that's the structure of the argument. That's not the details of the argument. So the Chalcedonian view, as far as I can tell, these are what historians will say. So this is what church historians will say. They will say the Chalcedonian statement is a compromise statement between different parties that couldn't quite agree on everything. And then Nestorius himself actually said, that's what I was saying all along. God, come on, guys. And so you're like, oh, okay. And then there were some different people in the East who were like, we don't like this view because it looks like it's Nestorian. And the response was, well, if you don't sign on it, off on this, then we're going to let the barbarians destroy you. And they're like, well, it's clearly not Nestorian now. We agree. And it's like, okay. So that's just what the historians will tell you. They maybe like not quite as colorfully as I just said it, but yeah.
I mean, I recall Leo in his letters, even before Chalcedon, he's giving, which of course the tome of Leo here is what I'm referring to, and it's of course received at Chalcedon, and the main reasons for Leo it seems to be is that he thinks this is the biblical support. I mean, he goes in the tome, he goes through a bunch of biblical passages for it. What would you maybe say in response to that? Those who would claim that the Chalcedonian formula is the biblical position.
I think some of the aspects of it are biblical. So the idea that you've got one person with two natures that's fully divine and fully human, I'm like, that's good. Some of the other details, though, where you've got two minds and two. Well, okay, you don't quite have the full two wills view in Leo. That view gets developed later, and so that you see that developed in like subsequent councils. But you do seem to have something like this two minds view, that there are two minds in Christ in the Chalcedonian view, and so this is what sometimes people will call a three-part Christology. So a three-part Christology means you've got God the Son. That's one part of Jesus Christ. And then another part is the soul. And then another part is the body. And so you've got these three parts. And they're related together in this ineffable and mysterious hypostatic relation. And so the claim then is that the Son does not suffer because he's an impassible being, so he can't suffer. The soul, though, in the human body, that's doing all the suffering. So Robert Jensen, he looks at this statement from Leo where Leo describes just that. And Jensen is like horrified by this. So Jensen's a Lutheran theologian in the late 20th century and 21st century. And he says, well, this is even worse than Nestorianism. Like, like what you've got is like, you've got the Son doing whatever he's doing. And then he brings in some other subject to do the suffering for him. Like this is awful. And so that's, I think, again, what you see this reaction from Jensen is it looks a lot like those reactions from some of those Eastern bishops when Chalcedon was written, going, how is this not Nestorianism? So I think that's some kind of internal inconsistency here if they're wanting to affirm this three-part Christology and then also go impassibility, which is what Chalcedon wants to do because they want to anathematize anybody who denies impassibility. So I think there's a problem there. So I think what you need is, if you want this Chalcedonian view, I think you have to get rid of impassibility, because I don't think you're going to be able to make it consistent with the rest of the claims of Chalcedon. I don't think you'll be able to get this fully divine, fully human nature in one person. Again, I haven't given you all the details of the argument, but that's, yeah.
This one's somewhat related. For Dr. Mullins, if the Father feels emotion, especially suffering along with his Son suffers on the cross, isn't that patripassianism?
Not exactly. So the claim would be that like the Father is somehow like suffering on the cross, and what's in view there is they're trying to attack like a modalist understanding of the Trinity, where what you really have is the Father himself is identical to like the same person as the Son, and so you've got the Father on the cross like suffering. They didn't have in view the idea that well, what if like the Father is a separate person and he suffers too? Like that just wasn't. No one even like considered that view in the early church, so that wasn't a heresy to condemn, because no one thought the Father was passable at all. None of the heretics thought that. The issue was always like, is the Son impassible or passable? So what you have really is kind of a more modern view of going, well, yeah, the Father suffers. It doesn't suffer on the cross because he's not on the cross. Only the Son is on the cross. He's suffering in a different way of going like, oh, that's really sad what's happening. And maybe he's like suffering out of empathy, but he's not suffering on the cross. So it's not this heresy that patripassianism is like it's talking about. You might go, well, but surely they should have condemned that, and you're like, well, but they didn't. So I don't know what to tell you. Like,
Random Theology asks, what does Dr. Mullins think of Stump's suggestion that the Incarnation allows God to be empathetic?
I find this suggestion really odd, and here's why. So Stump, in her work on Wandering in Darkness, and then her new book on Atonement, like this kind of problem that she gets for herself is, in order for God to really be close to us, God needs to have empathy, but he doesn't have any empathy. So he can't be united to human nature because he doesn't have any empathy. And I'm like, okay, so he can't be united to my humanity because he doesn't have any empathy. Okay. Well, then she's like, well, how do I get some empathy for him? Okay. Well, what if he's united to, this human nature of Christ? Well, there we go. We get the empathy from the human nature. And I'm like, you told me God could not be united to humanity because he lacks empathy. But now all of a sudden, magically, he can be united to human nature in Jesus Christ. the very thing that would like prevented God from being close to me, like, shouldn't that also be preventing God from being close to the human nature of Christ? Like that seems really odd. And so that's like one part of my overall argument for why I think this view is going to entail Nestorianism. But it seems like the very thing that prevents God from being related to humanity, that should carry over to the incarnation as well.
Hercule asks, can God change on what is good and evil? And so I guess to maybe add to that, if he could, well, if he can't change based on what's good because it might be based on his nature, his goodness, does that mean there's somehow now necessity on God and that then impacts free will? How would you answer that?
Yeah, so I want to say that God's essential properties, God can't change it in terms of his essential properties, because it's metaphysically impossible for you to gain or lose essential properties. So I do want to say God changes, but he can't cease to be perfectly good, because that's an essential attribute of God. Now, God's goodness is not going to change over time, and the necessary moral facts, those aren't going to change over time because they're necessary. The contingent moral facts, though, those could change. So, for example, God had no obligation towards Israel in terms of like keeping various promises, because he didn't always, wasn't in a covenant relationship with them. Then God was like, "Hey, Moses, let's. I want to do something. Let's enter into a covenantal relationship." And so now all of a sudden God acquires some contingent, like he makes contingent promises, and so now he takes on some obligations that he did not previously have. And so then that does bind God's will in certain ways. He's going to be faithful to the covenant. And that's a major biblical theme, is like the Israelites constantly going, "Oh, this horrible stuff's happening. God, where are you? You made promises. Why aren't you, where are you at?" And then God comes around and throws it back in their face going, "Yeah, you made promises too. What are you doing?" So you see this constant back and forth. So I would say, again, God's nature as like being perfectly good, that's not going to change. Whatever the necessary moral facts are, those aren't going to change over time. What the contingent moral facts are, those can change over time, and God can be bound in various ways that he freely enters into according to those things. So he can freely take on obligations.
Miguel asks, what would be some of the effects that we see in other areas of theology as a whole by affirming that God is passable?
I'm still thinking through this. So one of the things is I think you're going to have to get rid of timelessness and immutability. So Linda Zagzebski, she affirms passability. She wants to actually say that God is omnisubjective, that he empathizes with every single thing that you feel, no matter what, with all creaturely conscious states. So it's a very strong claim. But she still wants to say that God's simple and timeless and immutable. And I want to go, that doesn't make any sense. And so there's a forthcoming paper where I argue that's all incoherent. And here is why. So say God is eternally, or say suffering, because he's empathizing with your suffering. So God's suffering. Well, that means God is unchangingly suffering. And also he's timelessly suffering. No, that's bad. You don't want God timelessly suffering. And then I get to heaven, and I'm feeling great, because I'm in heaven. And then I walk up to God. I'm like, "Oh God, like, how are you doing?" And God's like, "Well, I'm in a state of eternal misery because I'm still empathizing with your, like all the horrible stuff you went through in the past." I'm like, "Well, that was over and done with." And he's like, "Yeah, well, I'm timelessly suffering. I can't like just get over something because that would require me changing. So I'm timelessly suffering." And I'm like, "Oh, well, God, it's kind of a downer, you're like kind of ruining this whole like heavenly party. Like that's bad." So I think this is a really unattractive view. So I think if you really want passability, you're going to have to get rid of timelessness. You're going to have to get rid of immutability. You're going to have to get rid of simplicity. So your thinking within the doctrine of God is going to have to change. Beyond that, though, other things that might change in your theology, I don't know.
This one's a curious one. So St. Ignatius of Antioch embraces impassibility, chapter 7 of his letter to the Ephesians. Could he have gotten it wrong, or could we have gotten it wrong for so long? He's a disciple of the Apostle John. What do you think here?
Yeah, I think there's lots of things that like the church got wrong for a really long time. So yeah, I think they could get it wrong. When you look at when you actually look at the overall biblical claims, you don't see impassibility at all there. And in fact, a lot of major proponents of impassibility admit that. They'll say you don't get it from Scripture. You have to get it from somewhere else. And then they'll try to explain, why does God reveal himself in passable ways when he's impassible? That's the standard move throughout the classical tradition, is to explain that, answer that question. Why does God reveal himself as passible when he is impassible? And they give these answers like, well, because you're too dumb to understand impassibility, so God has to reveal himself as passible in order to draw you like closer to him. So that's how the classical view like sees things. So yeah, I just think I don't think you're going to get impassibility out of Scripture. Now, can Ignatius get it wrong if he was John's disciple? Yeah, sure, why not? What's wrong with that? Lots of people get things wrong. I get things wrong all the time. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, you're coming from a different paradigm, I think,
Yeah.
probably than the questioner. I mean, the questioner is probably either Catholic or Eastern Orthodox. I mean, you're coming from a different paradigm as far as the role of the Father.
Yeah, so let me give you a biblical example of this then. Paul thinks that Peter got stuff wrong and rebukes him at one point. He's like, we're supposed to be able to like mix with the Gentiles. Why aren't, Peter, what are you doing? So like Paul just outright scolds him, that's right there in Acts. So yeah, like I think disciples got stuff wrong all the time and they corrected each other. So the idea of a disciple of one of the apostles getting something wrong, I'm just like, no big deal.
Yeah. I don't see any other questions, but this has been really, really fascinating. I want to have you back on again if you are willing to come on. Maybe we could have a discussion with another individual who perhaps takes the impassibility position and, see where it goes. I think that would be really, really fun, and I'm sure most of our viewers would really enjoy it. So, yeah, I'd love to have you back on to do that.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Any final parting words or any additional plugs you want to put in? I know I mentioned your book, but anything else that you want to put in there?
Yeah. So if people want to find out more, I've got my own show called The Reluctant Theologian, where I interview a lot of different people about different models of God and the issues on empathy and emotions and time. And then I'm currently working on a new book project called From Divine Time Maker to Divine Watchmaker, which is trying to explore what does it really mean to say that God's temporal, and then really trying to answer that question, what is time? And so I've got this new paper that just came out called The Divine Time Maker that's going to give people a snapshot of what this new book project is going to be looking like.
Excellent. And again, the book, God and Emotions God and Emotion, Elements in the Philosophy of Religion on Amazon.com. I'm putting it in the description in just a moment, but it is already available on Amazon as of 2020, so you could definitely get a copy there. I'm going to get a copy so that I can become more familiar with it. So if you come back on the show and I have maybe another individual on, I can maybe understand the position a little bit better, because like I said, I haven't had the chance to read it yet, but it does sound fascinating, so I'm definitely going to.
Cool. Sounds good.
Again, thank you for coming on. And everybody, thank y'all for your participation there in the chat. That was very fun. Great questions, too. I really appreciate those. Y'all made it very engaging. Of course, don't forget to like, subscribe, share this on your social media. And if you subscribe, hit the bell for notifications so you can be aware of any future upcoming shows that we're doing. And also check us out, patreon.com/Reason and Theology, if you want to get access to additional shows that we're doing and also support us. All right, well, that'll do it. Until next time, God bless you all.